Got
gotta
it?
go.
Okay.
I guess I do.
Yeah, good stuff. You got it hooked up now. So we're gonna be reading along Derek's book today, Warrior of the Light, for people that are just tuning into this. And I'll put the book up there some more. But Derek, I already kind of was reading some of it, and maybe like I usually do for people that maybe don't know who you are, maybe you could kind of tell them who you are and why you wrote this book.
Yeah, so I was born into an organized crime family. And I wrote a book when I was in prison about that life. And when I finished, I said to myself, what's the only other thing I'm qualified to write about? And it was martial arts and combat sports, because I've done that my whole life too. And I had some interesting run-ins, before MMA, after MMA, what MMA, made combat sports. And I happily shared my stories, much to the chagrin, I'm sure, of much of the MMA world.
Right. So, I was reading some of the early parts, and I'm going to go through this in just a moment. I'm just going to update something. We'll put my stuff on here right quick. Okay. So we're done. So put that in the background. But
I
anyway,
should get a background too, shouldn't I, Todd?
yeah, you should have a background too if you want. But one thing that I would like to start with that I think is pretty good for people that are kind of new to the sport is I'll just kind of read this part because I do want to read parts that are in the book. And one thing that I
Sure.
thought was pretty important was you said, I recall one advertisement that never missed an edition of the foremost magazine in the sector, Black Belt Magazine. So I think Black Belt Magazine was a big thing back then. And maybe you could elaborate on what Black Belt Magazine was and, just how big it was back then.
Sure. I mean, so at the time, martial arts were really the perfect venue for a magazine. Why? It was a lot like pro wrestling, and a lot of people don't know this, but like Jim Crockett created the NWA, and the NWA wasn't really much if you looked at the lights, the camera, the action. But Jim Crockett created a whole storyline out of the magazines. And there were a bunch of magazines on sale, all owned or contributed to by him, and people like were reading like a soap opera, right? And the occasional shows he threw, and then eventually he got to pay-per-view also. But you created this whole world through magazines at a time when the internet didn't exist, cable TV was only here and there. And I think for martial arts, that says a lot. And why, Todd? It's because back then, before the UFC, before MMA, every school was a silo. And don't get me wrong, this still happens with jujitsu today. But the students worship their teachers like they're, quite frankly, living gods, rather than men who became excellent martial artists. And every teacher would say that his style was the best. And those magazines were very much like that. And that one ad you're talking about is very much like that.
Yeah, but explain kind of like, because I know I used to read a lot and I would say it was very influential. So maybe talk about the importance of Black Belt Magazine back then.
So yeah, no, I mean, look, if you were into martial arts, there were a few: Inside Kung Fu, Inside Karate, but the godfather of all of them was Black Belt Magazine. If you have an analogy to boxing, it would be like Ring Magazine. It was the one everyone went to. And the things they said were very, very powerful. And just like I talked about, like how people were like back then, there was this one listener, and he wrote into Black Belt Magazine, and he was talking about Royce's fight with Kimo Leopoldo. And why? Because, listen, the UFC represented a direct threat to all the lives of those martial artists up to that point. Like, they could kind of live in their own heads, or live in their own dojo, or live in their own teachers' minds, right? And the UFC prevented that. And, when Royce fought Kimo, this guy wrote in a letter. He clearly hadn't seen the fight. He wrote in a letter like, I laughed as Royce submitted to Kimo. I laughed as Kimo walked through him. And the funny part about that was one of those guys, like a Dungeons and Dragons martial artist living in his own mind, dispelling the dragon of Royce Gracie who was going to, bring reality to martial arts. And, and in fairness to black belt, they put that in there. They put the guy's letter in, and below it, they put it in an editor's note like, Royce won this fight, but that's just how it was back then. And black belt was the voice of martial arts back then before MMA.
Yeah, and you kind of referenced one particular match, which was the John Matua Tank Abbott match. And you had referenced advertisement you had seen in there from the kind of like the coach of the bone breaking school. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there was this little tiny ad. It was like 2-3 inches, right? And it was in black and white. And there was a bunch of nasty Samoans surrounding this big white guy with a mullet. He looked like a blonde haired guy. You couldn't really tell because it was black and white. And it said bone breaking style, most dangerous martial arts in the entire world from San Pedro beachfront property. Now, San Pedro was near and dear to me. That's where my father was in prison, right? So all of this made sense to me. I said, oh, I want to be part of the bone breaking style. And that's what that ad was meant to do, is create this guy's myth. Now, one of those Samoan guys behind him was was it Matua?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Matua was one of those guys standing there. Now, Matua had one fight with this bone breaking style in the UFC, and that was against Tank Abbott. And Tank Abbott, like, he bullwaxed him with one punch, and that was the end of the bone breaking style. But I think that match was very good to show like the old martial arts where they all lived in their head through Black Belt magazine, and Black Belt was the focal point. And then to the UFC, where if you can do it and you say your bone breaking style, do it in the octagon.
Yeah, and another thing that I saw you reference, which I'm going to talk about here, is the Kempo stylist Keith Hackney, who used his moxie and heart to blow through many competitors with a style that has rarely been used since. And, I think it's interesting that you mentioned that because he was pretty effective, and, had he, I mean, I know he continued to fight a little bit, but I think had he really, dove into it heavily, he still could have had a lot of success, I think. So maybe talk about Keith Hackney a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'd be delighted. Listen, man, so people are going to be weirded out about it because, obviously John Hackleman is Kempo, which makes Chuck Liddell Kempo and anybody else who trains with him Kempo. But, Hackney actually used Kempo in a traditional sense, meaning those open-handed circular strikes. And by the way, I'm not going to say that those open-handed circular strikes were very effective in any way. I'm only going to say that John Hackney was one, or Keith Hackney was one tough guy. And, it didn't matter what style he was using, he was going to make it work. So I think that spoke more about Keith Hackney than it did about Kempo. I mean, Chuck was a Kempo guy, right? But he didn't throw those open-handed circular strikes. So yeah, man, I mean, Hackney was an incredible competitor. And that was early UFC, right? When you saw pure stylists going at it with each other. I don't think I've ever seen an overhand circular strike like that again with an open hand. But yeah, Hackney was amazing, man. Very, very tough guy.
Yeah, I think the history of MMA doesn't really give him credit that he kind of deserves, in my opinion. Because I would say, I know Kimo gave Royce a tough fight, but I think in some ways the fight that Hackney had in the next event with him kind of showed more flaws in Royce's game than even Kimo's, because Kimo's just a lot bigger than him. But Hackney was more Royce's size,
Yeah, I mean, look, Kimo wasn't truly even a martial artist, right? Kimo was a bodybuilder. I know he trained a little bit, but Hackney was an actual Kempo guy. And I think that's the big difference that you got to bring up with that. And it makes it way more impressive that, Hackney was 180 pounds, Todd. People forget that. He was maybe 6 foot, 5'11". Kimo was enormous. So there's a big difference there between the two. But what Royce had going for him at that time, and this is just a fact, and I don't mean it to be bad to any jiu-jitsu guys. That's all I train now, is that nobody knew what he was doing. And arm bars and triangles and stuff like that work much better when no one has any idea what you're about to do to them.
But I mean, that fight in particular, the fight with Hoist and Keith Hackney in UFC 4, even though Hoist was able to win it, I think in the early stages, it kind of showed maybe what people were going to use to beat the Gracies in the future.
Yeah,
As
no, listen, yeah, Hackney's an animal, man, and a true animal, as we all know. Everybody knows the jujitsu guy comes in, and he's such a force. He might be just a white belt, but he's like blowing through blue belts and stuff, and he's a power of nature, and that was Keith Hackney.
and as I'm kind of going on here, you kind of got into like some different guys that would show up, and then you referenced Maurice Smith. So you said that for the first time, striking arts have one of their own at the top, and you kind of blew a sigh of relief like many other longtime strikers. So maybe talk a little bit about Maurice.
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny. Like, I actually met Maurice over the phone. My kickboxing career ended, and I started wanting to promote. And there was this Vegas guy who you'll read about him later in the book. He was a lunatic, like a type of gangster type guy that called Maurice and Tiki at the time, actually, on the phone to talk with them about, promoting some fights and whatnot. But, I was a young kid. I didn't know what I was doing. Look, at Maurice Smith was sort of like the striker's Hail Mary. Like, everybody thought striking was valueless. Grappler's Edge was like a news column in the new martial arts magazines competing with Black Belt. And Maurice came around, right? And he won the title. And that was extremely important for every striker. Maurice was a kickboxer. In kickboxing, how do I say this? It's like unfortunately, the unloved redhead stepchild of fighting combat sports. As much as they try to make kickboxing popular, it doesn't seem to get there. It's gotten a little better with Glory and lion fights with the UFC, but it's not. And Maurice was one of these 12-round kickboxers, that stepped in and won the UFC title. And then, by the way, defended it against Tank Abbott, which I think was very important because that was like the Tank Abbott fight was the fight that said, hey, I can beat the Brawlers too. Because Maurice knocked out Coleman, right? Marco Coleman for the title. And Coleman was a wrestler. So now you got Maurice Smith beating not only the best wrestler in MMA, you got him beating the biggest tough guy in MMA. And I think that was a big moment for strikers in the sport.
Now, I want to kind of skip along a little bit because, you're kind of talking about kind of the establishment of the sport. But I kind of see you kind of started to get into like your time at the Scrap Pack, how you trained at the Scrap Pack. So maybe I know we had already done kind of an interview on that, but maybe expand on the Scrap Pack a little bit as far as when you first got there and why you went there.
Yeah, I mean, look, so there was a martial artist named Javier McKay, and he was an MMA fighter, but he had a deep background like me. He started in Shoin-ryu. His father was in Shoin-ryu. He was a capoeira fighter as well. So he kind of introduced me to those guys. Gil would actually pay Javi once in a while as a sparring partner in his fights. But, one of the things I noticed, and this is something I haven't really talked about directly, but I noticed when Javier sparred Gil, he was all defense, Todd. It was very much sort of a gentleman's agreement, like, yeah, hey, you don't hit the champ, you don't push the champ. So when I watched Javi spar with Gil in these sessions he would be paid for, he would just be moving the whole time. Now, when I sparred Gil, I hit Gil. Well, needless to say, me and Gil didn't spar much more after that. And, listen, so I go into it in my book a little bit, I think, but there's method to that madness. Like, I hear jujitsu guys talk about like sometimes you spar white belts all day in the gym and you get so used to winning that you hit the tournament and you win. And fighting's very much like that too. Gilbert, I watched him bar other sparring partners, stand-up guys, boxers who tool him up. He would never spar with them again. I remember I was at Fairtax. It was still open in San Francisco. And this boxer, Enrique, I forget his last name, but he was like top 50 in the world. And he was tooling Gilbert up. And Jake looks at me and says, well, that's a good sparring partner for Gilbert. I mean, and so maybe, they could say those words, but the reality was Gilbert never sparred that guy again. That was it. One and done. And why? Because you're taking the guy's championship mentality from him. You're saying, like, you're not as good as you think you are. And on fight night, fighting is so mental, that doesn't do them any good. So yeah, I mean, I think that sums up my whole time at the scrap pack, that one anecdote.
But I mean, I think there's some back and forth on that. Some people think the more you spar with people that are better than you, the more you'll improve. So maybe.
Todd, I thought that, my logic at the time was, you guys are on TV. If you can't beat me up, you're not gonna be able to beat the guy on TV up. So I'm gonna hit you as hard as I can. And I can just tell you in MMA that's just not appreciated. One of the things about MMA, and a lot of people don't realize it because there's a lot of grapplers, and the Scrap Pack is a grappling heavy team. The striking to them is sort of ancillary, right? Their game is to get people down and beat on them. And so the, beating them up, doing spin hook kicks and spin back kicks and stuff like that, they don't really appreciate. They don't know how to do it themselves. They're not any good at it. And you always got to watch that in MMA gyms. I thought, like, they'll see how good I am and they'll ask me questions. That never happened. They never asked Derek any questions at all. And you now know that, what they were saying behind my back.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of stuff goes on in all gyms, though, don't you think?
Yeah, well, listen, so like Todd, we talked about this, and I think most champions are young guys, right? And with that youth comes a lot of immaturity, right? So the Scrap Pack was very much like a high school, right? You're going to be one of the cool kids, or you're not going to be a cool kid. And I was definitely not one of the cool kids. I thought, the cool kid stuff's going to go out because they're going to see I whoop butt, but that's not the way it is. Everybody's got to protect their ego in one way or the other, and I understand that, especially fighters. And there got to be a group think that, Derek is terrible. Now, let me just say this, Todd, and this is my one disclaimer on this that I've got to say, like, so, Jake, Gil, Tarek Azim, all those guys up there saying I was terrible and that's why they didn't spar with me. Then I go down to San Diego and I'm sparring with Alliance guys, AJ Matthews, Joey Beltran. Those guys were like, oh my God, Derek, you are an animal. And AJ even joked like, hey, I'm avoiding you, dude. Because, I get it. It's the same thing. Like, hey, getting your butt kicked by the old guy doesn't help. Joey never avoided me, but Joey never became my friend either. So just the absolute absurdity. One of the reasons I got into combat sports and I really liked wrestling, which was my first, is I thought, okay, the subjectivity, the coach's opinion, the ref's opinion is all taken out of this. But you go through life and you start to realize that never comes out of life. People are always going to badmouth you and say things, and ego is a huge part of it. And that's just life, man. You got to learn to live with it and deal with it.
Now, I think one thing I do want to, because a lot of this is kind of like MMA history, so to speak. But maybe you could get further in, like, because I know you mentioned some stuff about Scott Coker and Strike Force in that area, and you lived in that area. So maybe talk a little bit about that when it was going on, or some of your memories of that, or what its impact was on that area, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, my memory was pretty plain at that point. I was pretty well versed in my father's criminality and how things are promoted. And what really amazed me about Scott, and I'm not taking anything away from him because the guy's a multimillionaire and now he's running Bellator. So, but I want people to really think about this. Strike Force was really just two areas. It was Bay Area, California, and it was St. Louis, Missouri. And that's it. Like, those were the only places he held cards. He got TV contracts, something he learned from kickboxing. He was on CBS. That was when the Melendez and the Diaz brothers punched Mayhem Miller after Jake Shields' fight with him. Or no, after his victory over Dan Anderson, actually. And that was like MMA was on live network TV, and they got really scared after that. But what I'm saying is that Coker made what essentially was a world organization out of Bay Area and St. Louis. And that's pretty interesting when you think about it. And the more you get into the fight game, you recognize that all these organizations, They're world titles because they say they are. And that goes for all of them. Now, some of them have more renown than others, right? It's their footprint and where they've been. But Coker was a master of creating a footprint out of eyeballs on TV. Not so different than Jim Crockett at the NWA and pro wrestling, right? Where we just talked about the magazines, right? So now you see these guys on network television, you think, oh, this is the world title. What do you mean world title? It's the middleweights in St. Louis against the middleweights in Bay Area, but that doesn't really matter. You know what I mean? And it doesn't make those athletes less than. It's just the way life works out and the way we promote things.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that because I would say almost all of the promotions, like you talk about, I mean, they do that, especially the regional promotions who say that, they're world champion or whatever, but really it's just like the world champion of a certain neighborhood in in their area, basically.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. Look, so back in my kickboxing days, and I cover this as you get more in the book, you'll read it, Todd. So, like, I went down to Mexico and I fought a pro fight. It was my first fight. Then I come back across the border and I fight the same guy in Whittier. And it's an amateur fight, and what was that? Well, what it was amateur promotions didn't owe the commission a lot of money. So the promoters made them amateur, but they weren't wearing headgear. They weren't wearing shin guards. It was a pro fight by all means, for the athletes at least. But that's what this whole business is, man. And that promoter said to me something after I was done fighting for him a while. He goes, Derek, let me explain something to you. You never say amateur or pro. The bottom line is it's a kickboxing event. And that woke me up. It's like, well, you don't say, San Francisco and St. Louis. You say world title. And yeah, I mean, Jesse Taylor was my good friend. He was from down there at Quest in San Diego. And he's won like 8 world titles. Yeah, they're all, local promotional titles, and that's how the fight game is. And it's just funny that it goes all the way back to the NWA with Jim Crockett and all that. It's funny to me.
You remember how Jesse Taylor got to like the finals of the Ultimate Fighter, and then it showed him like binging they took him out the night before, and he got all crazy, and they didn't let him, compete in the finals.
Well, Todd, so let me say this. Yeah, I remember that. But then, so I'm doing prison time again, right? And Jesse Taylor makes it to the final of the Tough Redemption. And he wins the final. And he kisses Dana White on TV. And I'm thinking to myself, because I had sparred Jesse both in San Francisco and San Diego. And I'm like, God, I feel so good for him. Great. And I get out. And years later, I asked Sokoudjou, I say, man, what happened? And Sokoudjou told me that he never actually fought in the UFC after that. Like, for whatever reason, they couldn't come to an agreement. Well, what happened with that?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of crazy that he. Yeah. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you about because you had mentioned Mexico, and we kind of, I was kind of glossing through some of the first chapter. A lot of this, I would say, I mean, of the book itself, is it mostly like a kind of like a history of or history of martial arts in general? Is that how you would describe it?
Well, so Todd, first and foremost, and this may turn people off, it's the history of my combat sports martial arts journey, right? But along with that journey, because of the eras I lived through, you will catch a lot of history. And you'll catch a lot of boxing history, kickboxing history, MMA history, early history, obviously. Yeah, because I'm tracking my life. I'm tracking what I went through. So, yeah, that's what most of that is.
And you had mentioned Mexico, fighting in Mexico, so I kind of want to touch on something that I had talked about on my MMA Conspiracy Hour show, which was the Phil Baroni situation in Mexico. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and what you know about Baroni in general. Mexican prison. You've been in prison, obviously, so maybe talk about a little bit about Phil and then what you think he's going through.
Yeah, I mean, Baroni, look, I mean, he had a losing record overall. Baroni was one of those guys who was a character, right, at the perfect time in MMA, right? He had the huevos, if you will, to jump in there and fight, the baddest guys in the world. And occasionally he won, right? I think he knocked out Pete Sell, maybe. I don't know. He's got one or two signature victories. But the problem is that personality. It's a little bit like what was that other guy's? Kopenhagen, War Machine. They're unfortunately they take that crazy antisocial personality and they try to put it over combat sports. And here's the reality, and we learned this with Tank Abbott. If you really want to be a professional athlete, a professional fighter, the less you live like that in any way, the better it is for you. Baroni came at a really early time, right? As did Tank Abbott, which allowed them to sort of get in there when normal people were like, I'm not getting in there. I'm not doing that. But the truth, and War Machine was not much different. He was a little bit later, right? So a little bit more polished. So I wouldn't say that he was that much more polished a fighter. Some guys just have certain gifts, whether it's knockout power that allow them to compete with guys who are better than them. But the truth of the matter is the best fighter is a godly man who doesn't drink, doesn't smoke, doesn't allow those things to overcome his life. And, Todd, if there was, there's many failures in my fighting career, obviously, coming in and out of prison. But along with that, I was also a drinker. I was, I was very loose with women. I did a lot of bad things. And those things really don't help you when you're fighting. And Baroni, unfortunately, that's who he is. He never changed. He made a larger than life personality out of himself. And, now he's going to have to pay for it. Prison in Mexico is not a nice place to be. There are a lot more like United States prisons now, but with one exception, the guards will beat you relentlessly with no problem. And there's no consequences for them. Here, if they do that, there may be consequences at some point. So, yeah, I feel sorry for Baroni. It's bad story all around, man. But that's how those guys are like. It's the same reason War Machine's doing 25 years, right? It's they can't handle themselves and they get insanely jealous over their women, which, you got to grow up at a certain point. We all have faced that pain, women who are unfaithful to us, right? Women who cheat on us with their friends. I think that's a very common thing to go through in life. And how you react to it, I think, says a lot about your character. If you kill the woman like Baroni did, maybe you're not made of that much character.
Right, but some people aren't, and I think this is something that isn't talked about a lot, is some people just aren't cut out to not be fighters anymore. Especially, when they're done with the UFC, whether it was Bonner, and they were in business together, Bonner and Baroni, but for a while at least. Those two guys especially, War Machine wasn't out of MMA yet, so his thing wasn't like he was done yet. But I would say Bonner and Baroni were not prepared to not be fighters anymore, you know?
Well, Todd, I mean, look, that's a rough thing for anybody. Look, I can tell you this. So let's go into my debauchery a little. In San Francisco, I was still a criminal and I was living high on the hog and I had tons of money. And one of the girls that I was seeing, obviously paying, Tiny Amber Brown, God bless you, Tiny, she said to me one day, hey, I'm seeing Jake Shields. And I smiled to myself, of course you are. You see him because he's Jake Shields. And she burst out laughing. She's like, that's right, Derek. Of course, that's why I'm seeing him. So, for Jake also, that's a big change. Jake's a middle-aged man. He's in his 40s. It looks like his hair isn't hanging on as much as it was before. Maybe that's because of steroid use, maybe not. So he goes from being the big man in San Francisco that all women want to talk to him. And by the way, Jake's very shy, very taciturn, like doesn't have an outgoing personality. So now you can imagine, he can't put on the I used to be Jake Shields. He's just this quiet, weird guy in a corner now. And yeah, I think that's hard for anybody, man. You go from being a superstar to being Joe Schmo. And, here's the thing that would, yeah, I mean, that's just for all of those guys. I think that happened. For Bonner, he hid in drugs. For Baroni, he never changed. For War Machine, he obviously made a tragic mistake, both for him and the people he hurt.
But why do you think someone like Phil would go down to Mexico and then just stay there? I mean, I know he started like a GoFundMe to get out of Mexico. He said he was trying to get back home, that he had gotten some trouble down there. And then once he got all the money that people gave him, He just stayed. Why do you think he stayed down there?
Well, Tom, let me say this to you. So, I mean, God bless. God has a plan for all of us. The question is if we're listening. And God led me to Utah with my wife. And I love that. But let me tell you what my plan was when I was in prison. I was learning Spanish. I'm fluent now, and it's helped me a lot. But my plan was going straight to Tijuana. Working in San Diego, having expenses in Tijuana. And my guess is Baroni got in whatever, 5 grand, 2 grand, whatever he got. And he said, wow, this money will go a lot further down here than it will across the border. Why don't I just stay? Because, listen, the bottom line is you got money in your pocket. It doesn't really matter where you are. And Baroni did the math. My money's going to go further here.
Yeah, but while that is true, it probably would be harder for him to continue making income, don't you think?
Without a doubt. And that's the big joke, right? That's why my plan was the border, right? So I could cross that border and I could make money in San Diego and then spend that on expenses in Tijuana. So that was my plan, and it's millions of other people's plans. That's why the border traffic is so bad. Um, I don't know what Baroni was thinking. A lot of those guys are immediate gratification, right? And that goes what fighting is, and that's who they are. And obviously that's what Baroni was. That it probably explains why he stayed.
Yeah, I mean, I spent some time around Baroni a couple of times, and you could tell he was off. Like he's the kind of guy who could go off at any moment, possibly. So it was definitely a. I mean, even back then, you knew this is the kind of guy who probably wasn't going to have a positive ending.
Yeah, well, Todd, so let me say this. It's kind of funny as we're going through our histories here. Like back in my day, every single fighter was a whack job. And by the way, I include myself in that, right? Come from a criminal family, trying to figure out life. Like I was a weird guy. That's what got me in the ring, got me fighting every day, liking getting punched in the face. Now fighters are a little different. And I call it, maybe it's not fair. I call it the sissification of MMA. What do I mean by that? Well, guys like Gilbert Melendez, right? He's a wrestler. He had a good childhood. He was a star college wrestler, and they come in, and suddenly the whole game is different, right? They don't want to get hit really hard. And by the way, I know I'm picking on Gil, but that's any number of people in MMA like that because MMA is so popular. Everybody's trying it. Guys that really shouldn't be fighters at all. And they find ways to justify their ego, and that's the way it is. So yeah, I mean, back in the old days, man, they were really wacko. And Baroni's probably a retread from the old days.
Now, I kind of wanted to keep the interview kind of concise, but we'll do another chapter here soon. Let's see if this shows up on the background, but maybe it doesn't. But I got the
I
book.
got it. I'll
I
put
you
it up,
can see
John.
it here. Yeah, if I put it here.
As my big
Yeah.
balls.
So this Warrior of the Light, Derek's book, one of them. We'll do some stuff on his other book for sure, and you know, maybe talk to people about what it is in general, and then where they can find it.
Yeah, so both of my books are on Amazon, Todd. Greed and Fear. If you want to learn about what the mafia does today, that's your book. My prison experiences. Warrior of the Light is all martial arts and combat sports, and it's really deep. A lot of boxing because there was no MMA for a long time. Talks about what MMA gyms are like today. Talks about what trainers are like. The manipulation that goes on in the game. So I think for any young fighter, I think it's a great book for them to read.
So they can just find on Amazon. And how much is it?
So if I'm not mistaken, Warrior of the Light's about $20, and Greed and Fear a little bit more. Find them both on Amazon. Just Google Warrior of the Light, Derek, and that will pop up.
All right, Derek. Well, I appreciate it, and maybe we can get into some Greed and Fear. I don't know if you want to do it later today or another